Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Can I invite those of you who are still standing to try to find a seat? We're going to get started now. It's time to start with our ERC event, Sustainable Future for Europe, the contribution of frontier research. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you who are here with us in the room this evening, but I'd also like to welcome people who are following us online. We're web streaming live via the European Commission's corporate channels, EBS and the social media platforms this evening, via our own European Research Council accounts, and also through our media partner, Euractiv, who we're very happy to be working with on this evening's event. So I'd really encourage those of you who are following us online, but also here in the room, if you would like to interact, to share, to comment, to ask questions using the hashtag on Twitter, that's #ERCSDGS. And there will be some opportunity to collect one or two questions later in the evening, particularly the panel debate in a few minutes' time, which will be moderated by Jennifer Baker. But without further ado, I'd like to kick off our opening session by inviting our President, the President of the European Research Council, Jean-Pierre, to deliver the opening remarks.
Thank you very much for everyone for being here. But I want to greet some special people here. So first, Mrs. Eva Kaili, who is a member of the European Parliament and the President of the Science and Technology Options Assessment Group. So thank you very much for me here. And also Mrs. Leti Hogan for being here. She's the the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Research and Higher Education in Finland. Thank you for being with us. We're still waiting for a few people, for example, the Commissioner, who will be soon with us. She's busy with something else at the moment, but she will be joining. And also State Secretary Ante Cic from Croatia, who will join us very soon. But also I want to greet some friends from outside Europe or European living outside Europe at the moment who have made us the great honor of joining us. So the first one I want to really thank for being present, and really we appreciate very much his effort, is Sir Peter Ratcliffe, who got, as you know, the Nobel Prize, and just before his Nobel Week he agreed on coming, which really is a fantastic gift to us. But also I want to greet Subra Suresh, who is presently the President of Nanyang Technical University in Singapore. So thank you so much for making a long way to be with us. But also Robert Dijkgraaf, who is Dutch, as his name seems to indicate, but presently is the director of the Institute for Advanced Study, which is really a great institution. So we are extremely grateful for all these people to contribute to this discussion. You will see soon that also we have another greeting from the US in the person of Franz Cordova, who sent us a video. So before I really give the floor to Mrs. Kaili, I wanted just to tell you why did we organize this high-level policy event at this moment. Actually, when we decided to have this, a lot of uncertainties were around. You probably heard that the country is thinking of leaving the EU recently, and we thought the problem would be solved when we would meet in December. It looks like the problem is not yet solved, so we have to wait, and of course this creates some trepidation on the side of scientists across the channel, I must say. But also at the same time, we didn't know that which commission will be in place when we thought about the format. And we are very pleased now there is a commission with a very strong determination to move forward and do very ambitious things. So that's for us, of course, a very important element in the development, the future development of Europe, in the science in Europe, to have a commission very determined. And of course, we knew that the process of really advancing the agreement on the next framework program would probably be not completely resolved. Actually, it's even less resolved than we thought. We got yesterday, thanks to the energy of the Finnish presidency, a revision of the proposal by the Commission, which now will, I'm sure, will serve for the EU Council as a basis for further discussions. But the process is not yet finished. And then the topic itself, which is really the contribution of the necessity of taking into account frontier research in the future of Europe, if you want this future to be sustainable, is definitely something we feel is extremely important. So the purpose of the European Research Council, as you know, is to support research in the completely bottom-up way by trusting researchers, convincing them to send their most ambitious project. And therefore, one thing we witness, and actually we had the meeting yesterday and today to really make this very explicit, is the capacity of researchers to anticipate what will be the main challenges of the future and also suggesting some solutions. And so therefore for us, frontier research is really something of great importance because it forces you to really take a long view, not just being obsessed by the immediate future, which of course is obsessive, but sometimes one has to get over his own obsession to really get the right solution. So this was the spirit of this meeting, that is to try and make the case for frontier research, in particular in the context of what are the resources of Europe, how can one make the resources of Europe sustainable, and how we can really contribute to really Europe in the world. And that was also another reason why we asked non-Europeans to give us their vision of the future of the world, but also how Europe will be fitting in this future. I don't want to speak much more. I want to give the floor now to Eva Kaili, who I'm sure will give us very wise words on how the Parliament sees the future of frontier research and the sustainable future for Europe. Eva, please.
Welcome all, and Professor Bourguignon, I cannot thank you enough, not just for your kind words, but also for the collaboration we had and what you managed to succeed while you had this incredible mission for Europe at the most difficult times. I have to thank Sabine also, because we managed to establish a very close cooperation with the European Parliament to make sure that politicians will understand your mission, and we will be able to improve together how we see the future and how we can develop our new cooperation. So I'm very glad to be invited once again to a very interesting ERC event. And since we are living in a transforming world, everything is changing. We have new economic and societal challenges, and we definitely need new solutions. And these new solutions can only come from research, innovation, and of course, we have our hopes to our scientists, and we're very proud to say that Europe is actually leading in terms of research. What we will try to do is to make sure that with the contribution of frontier research, that the mission that you now have, you have to define the priorities we should have as Europeans, because sometimes the complexity and the urgency of these challenges cannot be always understood thoroughly and tackled efficiently by traditional models of research and funding or politicians. So definitely we need you to have better knowledge and understanding of what the priorities should be. Since 2007, 9,000 projects have been selected for funding, and there were 65,000 applications. So there is need for increased funding for excellence and research, especially in Europe. And the results are that ERC grantees have won prestigious prizes. I can include including 7 Nobel Prize winners. And I'm very proud that today also we have with us Sir Peter Ratcliffe, Nobel Prize winner for 2019. In physiology or medicine, along with William Kaelin and Greg Semenza for their breakthrough interdisciplinary work into the chemistry, physiology, and therapeutics, for their breakthrough for their cell sense and signal hypoxia, so how the cells, when you remove oxygen, they react. It's excellent research, and I have to say that STOA, I'm chairing it, it's a Science and Technology Options Assessment. We try to get data for politicians to make decisions, not just budget, but also priorities that we have and legislation. they are really not just appreciating ERC, but we are trying to create basically support in the new budget for 2021-2027 for ERC. And we have been co-organizing a big annual event now together with you, and you started that, so I'm very happy that we are able to continue investing in researchers shaping Europe's future. We talked about agriculture, CRISPR, migration, demographic challenges, but now the new priorities we have is artificial intelligence and how it transforms every sector, and how people are concerned and how we can address their concerns, and the Green Deal. So basically, how we can have technology for good. Because for us, the priority is to make sure that people will be benefiting by scientific expertise. So our commitment is to try and fight for an increased budget. I have to say that with artificial intelligence, we're going to have also an ethical challenge. So we have to make sure that we will have enough data for you to be able to work. I remember when we had this dinner with Nobel Prize winners that you introduced us to, they all talked about the need of good quality of data. So this really helped us to make it our priority. And one of the files where we are going to work, and probably I will also work, 2020, it's going to be open data, to make sure that data for scientists will be available, better quality data sets. So this is a commitment. We will try to make sure it will not be one size fits all. For research, for healthcare, for people, we have to think differently. And because I don't want to take more of your time, I want to say that I also try to represent the European Parliament, but also a good friend who is the President of the European Parliament, David Sassoli, who unfortunately couldn't be here, but he asked me to read his message to you, and I will do that. So, distinguished guests, it's my deep regret that due to previous institutional duties, I cannot be with you in person for this important event scheduled for today in Brussels. The European Research Council is a unique bottom-up funding agency supporting research projects at the cutting edge of all scientific disciplines, selected on the sole criterion of scientific excellence. First of all, I want to greet Sir Peter Ratcliffe, ERC grantee in 2008, and one of the 2019 Nobel Prize laureate in medicine. He's certainly an inspiration for us all, as the ERC is for research funding agencies. To be competitive at a global level and to secure a sustainable future for Europe, our institutions must invest more and more in frontier research and innovation. He's from my party, so we are together in this fight. By supporting frontier research through ERC, we simultaneously lay the foundation for future innovations and competitiveness of European industries to make Europe attractive for the best minds whose presence is necessary to develop new knowledge and skills. With my best wishes for a productive event to all participants, I send you my warmest regards. David Sassoli. Thank you for that. And just to add one thing, the same lines, to say that to be globally competitive maybe doesn't mean we're going to be more profitable, or we're not going to have the same access to funding like US, or we will not remove all the barriers for data like China does, because China controls data and mass surveillance is not an issue. But for Europe, I think where we can lead is to have a mission-driven excellence and research, and to make sure that it's going to have quality of life for people and the citizens in the years to come, to make sure it's going to be the best place for someone to live, a heaven maybe on earth. Thank you.
So thank you very much to our first speakers, Professor Bourguignon and Eva Kaili, MEP. We're now going to be hearing from Professor Franz Cordova, the director of the NSF in the United States, who would have loved to be here with us this evening. I believe she's actually on her way to Antarctica at the moment, so she wasn't able to join us, but she did really want to send us this message, and we're going to be seeing the video that she sent now.
Pierre Bourguignon. Sounds nice, doesn't it? Even better if I could parler français. The name connotes to us in the global science community leadership in the face of complexity, a sense of purpose in a time of many choices, an intellect that is deep yet broad, and a commitment to the next generation of scientists and scholars. Empowering young researchers is, in fact, the most singular of Jean-Pierre's motivations, and he has devised tools at the European Research Council to do just that. In fact, about 2/3 of the funds of the ERC go to younger people. He has introduced synergy grants to support young researchers, not only in Europe, but internationally. Importantly, Jean-Pierre is a great listener. He takes the time to listen to the many voices on the ERC Scientific Council, where the decisions are ultimately made. This takes time, but once decisions are made, they're sustained. Jean-Pierre has led the ERC to think of its actions as global actions. The mission statement of the ERC is compelling. A consequence of his leadership is that Europe is increasingly looked at as a leader in bottom-up frontier research. The research, in fact, that is a prerequisite for sustainability. And that is the theme of today's discussions and reflections: how frontier research can contribute to sustainable development. I'm sorry not to be able to join you for this meeting. I'm on my way to Antarctica with several leaders of American science and technology. We will experience firsthand the consequential changes happening in the South Polar region. NSF has management responsibility of the 3 bases in Antarctica. My agency also leads the U.S. Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee of the White House. NSF funds much research at both poles, trying to learn more about the impact of changes in the land and ocean and atmosphere. So I, too, am on an exploratory mission that will review the research we fund that is essential to policymaking. NSF funds many programs in sustainability. These programs help us better understand our natural environment, including the system of food, water, and energy that we rely on for our daily lives, as well as the ecology and evolution of infectious diseases. We're learning more about built environments through research into sustainable urban systems and how coastal processes affect populated areas. And because it is critical to think about global impacts, NSF supports research and capacity-building activities in developing countries to enhance sustainability. NSF support is enabling technology that will transform how people interact with their communities, receive health care, succeed in the workplace, and live their lives. Through smart and connected systems that draw on artificial intelligence, data information science, engineering, social and behavioral research, and other areas, scientists and engineers are opening new paths for sustainable societies. Sustainability research and engineering is cross-cutting and interdisciplinary, and it relies on partnerships and collaboration. At NSF, we call that approach convergence research, and it is an agency-wide priority. NSF is excited to be a partner with the ERC in the convergence of research, ideas, and leadership that will lead to a more sustainable future. Jean-Pierre, we have been friends through 6 years of meetings on the Global Research Council and additional science conferences all over the world. You are one of the people I always seek out for counsel and a good laugh at perhaps some silly thing that has happened. You have great wisdom, and this has been a source of strength and assurance for me. I wish you very well, my dear friend, as you begin a new chapter. And on behalf of NSF, I wish all of you a very productive conference today.
So So the next part of our program this evening is a panel debate that we've organised in partnership with Euractiv. So I'm very pleased now to leave you in the capable hands for the next hour of Jennifer Baker, who is an EU Affairs and Technology journalist based here in Brussels, better known to many who follow her on Twitter as Brussels Geek, which is her Twitter username. And thanks very much, Jennifer, for agreeing to be here this evening and leading the panel debate now.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you all very much for your attention. As Tony mentioned, I do like to tweet, and this will also allow people at home to get involved. If you have questions, I will try and keep an eye on my phone. Use the hashtag ERCSDGS. So that stands for ERC Sustainable Development Goals, plural, so an extra S there on the end. And I would now, as you can hear, I have a little bit of a sore throat, so I am very pleased that we've got such a distinguished panel who will do a lot of the heavy lifting for me. You'll be listening to them and not me. So please, if I could ask my panelists to join me. Of course, we have Sir Peter Radcliffe, who needs no introduction, but we'll get one anyway, the Director for the Target Discovery Institute at Oxford University and Director of Clinical Research at the Francis Crick Institute in London, and of course, an ERC grantee. Please, Peter. Also, Professor Robert Dijkgraaf, who is the author of The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge and, of course, Director of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. And it was already mentioned, Professor Subra Suresh, President of Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Please. And last but by no means least, Anita Lehikoinen, who is the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Education and Culture from Finland, of course still holding on to the EU presidency for another few weeks. Thank you all very much. Now, the title of this panel is A Global Perspective on Frontier Research with a View to Sustainability. So let me ask all of you a very broad question just to start and get a feel for your perspective. Where do you see the main intersection and the importance of that intersection between undirected research and these sustainable goals that we want to reach? Peter, let me start with you.
Well, I think...
Microphone.
First of all, I wanted to draw a distinction between...
Can we hear it? Mike? Give it a tap.
Yeah. Okay.
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, I guess we should make our definitions clear first. I don't particularly like the word basic research, nor curiosity-driven research, nor bottom-up driven research. I'm going to call it passion-driven research. And I'm going to make the distinction this way between passion-driven research and a money, salary-driven activity. Most human beings do their work for their salary. That's not unreasonable. In science, we're fortunate in being able to follow our passion, akin to sportsmen, musicians, artists. And I think we should see it that way. That's my distinction between passion and between when there's a commercial goal that's clearly evident, then of course money can be brought to play, and that too is very important activity, but I see the distinction that way.
Well, I think if we talk about the great challenges like sustainability, I mean, often I've been asked, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And I think I'm an optimist. In the sense, there are many problems that the world is confronted with. I'm not sure we find solutions, but here I think I see there must be a way to find technological solutions. But it's clear that the technologies that we need for that aren't there yet. But there's the incredible promise of what we can discover. And I think we know that science is able to do things which are not incremental, but are major leaps. If you think about, the biomedical field now, it would be unimaginable if it didn't first, worked on DNA and genes and a molecular basis of life. So I think, in that sense, I'm a guarded optimist that I do feel that, where we are right now in the development of science, with the incredible opportunities, the talent, the technologies, the way these various disciplines come together, we should be optimistic that we can make major breakthroughs. But these major breakthroughs will be borrowing the passion, will be coming because there are probably individual researchers, teams of researchers who desperately want to understand the nature of things. And we know it's, in some sense, the most effective way to address big issues. You never scale a mountain, walking straight up. You build base camps. You go around. You secure lines and ladders, and you have a systematic way to approach this. And I think that's what you want to do in the future.
So there are a couple of things about basic research. We just heard from my colleague Franz Cordova, the current director of NSF. One of the remarkable things that led to the very foundation of the U.S. National Science Foundation was the fact that it is one of probably the only agency in Washington whose mission is not to push any mission. The Energy Department focuses on energy, NASA focuses on space, etc. But NSF doesn't push any one mission. And this is one of the remarkable things about basic research, or whatever we call this, passion-driven research, that the rewards come in very unanticipated ways that cannot be predicted. If we can predict the outcome, it's probably not the most innovative research. I think, so that's the first point I want to make. The second point, a very good example of the impact of such research is what we do, what the U.S. National Science Foundation does in the continent of Antarctica. We have telescopes that do fundamental research about stars and basic astronomy, astrophysics, etc. You have material science research that looks at crystal formation inside fish, penguin populations. We have artists in residence who look at the sky in Antarctica and the Arctic. You look at all of these fields coming together and also synthesize them in a particular way, involving 51 countries. And I think that's the beauty of research, and that's the beauty of frontier research. And there is no frontier that's more challenging than the continent of Antarctica.
Yes, this is very interesting discussion from the point of view of governments, because sometimes we still have to discuss, even in Finland, about the importance of financing or funding basic or passion-driven research. Because there are some people who say that shouldn't we put all the money in innovation and expect results for the economy and for the benefit of people. But we say that we need more knowledge and we need more information and data, but especially we need more understanding what is happening. And we do not get this kind of knowledge and understanding if we do not fund and have good conditions for frontier research. So this is why I think it is very important task also for national governments and obviously for the EU to put extra money to frontier research. And of course, it is all about international collaboration, because now all the grand challenges, they are facing all of us, so they are not national missions for anyone. So we have to do it together and rely on research.
Well, we're talking about sustainability, and obviously this is something that comes up a lot with politicians, but also in the media, and more broadly we're hearing a lot of interest on it. I mean, obviously we want to let researchers follow their passion in this area, but are they going for sustainability? Are there ways to nudge researchers to sort of tackle these big international challenges, Peter?
Research is the art of the tractable. Now, my objection to the word curiosity is it implies a certain casual view of research. These people are trying to discover important things. They're passionately trying to do that. So this is their view of what their research topic is, usually the most important and impactful that they can think of, and the most tractable. Of course, trying to address questions that are not tractable is not going to help. So that, I think, is the best I can do. It is a much more serious decision, the research topic, than might be implied by some of the conversations about bottom-up or curiosity-driven. We really do think what we think is important, but tractable in our own hands. Because, of course, we're competitive people. We want to win things and discover things, and, we're explorers.
And in terms of sort of nudging this, and I'm going to come on to the filthy subject of money. I mean, research must be funded. I mean, this sort of passion-driven, if you like, or basic or undirected research, is it more difficult to get the funding for that? I mean, how do you make the case for that sort of funding? Peter, I'll stay with you and then we'll come to it.
Well, at a higher level or at a lower level? At a lower level, I'm experienced with writing grants. I think there's no excuse. I mean, you should set out your stall and articulate your position clearly. I think we do have a lot to learn as scientists in communicating. By that, I mean communicating ideas to other people, other scientists. So that's one reflection. At a higher level, I think the problem really is important and is much more difficult. And there is an excuse for it. It's readily possible to see how our arguments are difficult to promote with someone who's running in government. Essentially, I'm arguing, pay me to do what I want. Now, I have to I really do have to justify that in a responsible way. I'm trying to do that, but it's always going to be a difficult matter, since they will say, well, you would say that anyway, you're a scientist. So I think the scientists have a great responsibility to explain themselves clearly and to explain that they are really, really serious people trying their best to address these problems in the way, I think, as you rightly pointed out, what is tractable here and now. Not all problems are, and not all views of what might be tractable are the same. You have to trust the individual rather than you trust a striker in a football game to kick the ball into the net. You can't say, well, you use your left foot now or your right foot. At a certain point, you have to trust your player.
Just to add to this, I think, if you have a research portfolio, in some sense, I often use the metaphor of kind of investments, financial investments. We know that you don't get any returns if you don't take a certain amount of risk. So it's about, how much are we willing to invest in basic frontier research? And I think actually the fact that society is now putting this pressure for all these grand challenges, and we want you scientists to solve this. It's almost asking, well, I need these kind of returns. But that actually means that you have to be very disciplined. And this actually, I feel, in the light of these challenges, we have to make the case that the only way science can truly address this, not incremental, but truly find fundamental breakthroughs, is to kind of harness all that power that's in the minds of particular young scientists in fields coming together. So which is a little bit a paradoxical situation, right? So because you would love to see these solutions tomorrow, but we know that's actually not the way society is going to address this. So I think actually it creates really a demand of a lot of discipline, particularly I think for Europe, which is complicated to make these kind of investments now, because we actually do need the returns of research.
Is it difficult in Singapore, Sib?
No, it's the same everywhere. I think we have a responsibility that research is funded through taxpayer money. It doesn't matter which government, which country. So we have an obligation to justify how judiciously we are using taxpayer money. I think it's up to us as scientists to do this. But you asked about sustainability of frontier research. I want to pick up 3 points related to this, not at the individual scientist level, but collectively as a community of scientists. 3 points. The first one, if we look at the lessons learned from the 20th century, to me, one of the most revealing statements was when at the turn of the millennium, in the year 2000, when the U.S. National Academy of Engineering released a report on the 20 greatest engineering achievements of the 20th century. Electrification, commercial aviation, creating nuclear power, creation of the internet, advanced materials, etc., etc. Then 3 years later, the same National Academy of Engineering in Washington came up with a list of the 14 grand challenges of the 21st century. Climate change, carbon sequestration, containing nuclear terror, securing cyberspace. So if you put the two lists side by side, many of the grand challenges appear to be, at least at first sight, a direct consequence of the enormous achievements of the 20th century. So collectively as a community, as we look at grand challenges, at least taking that one example, it's important for us to learn what was missing in our thinking collectively in the 20th century so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the last century for future generations. So that's an important point. And very quickly, I think this time in the 21st century, we have an additional issue related to the first point, and that is it's not going to be just science and technology. It's equally how humans use, misuse, and abuse technology, either intentionally or unintentionally. That's going to make a big difference, whether it's fields like such as AI or data science or some other field. And the last point I would like to make related to this, especially with the grand challenges and frontier science, is if there is a great level of inequality, I'm not talking just about income inequality, I'm talking about digital inequality. Half the world population doesn't have access to the internet. Then I think perhaps we are not going to have a sustainable future that's going to emerge out of frontier research. Those are the 3 points that come.
I very much like your middle point, because I hear this a lot at tech conferences, and a lot of the problems we seem to be addressing, they're actually cultural problems, not really technology problems. But, I wanted to put to you, though, the issue with unforeseen consequences is that they're unforeseen. Do you think that they're unforeseeable in many cases? And are we asking the right people to look into the future and imagine or foresee these unforeseen consequences?
I think there are consequences that we cannot, there are unknown unknowns, but there are known unknowns. For example, when we look at climate change and especially if we look at the last century and automobiles and assembly lines and so forth, I would argue personally that it was not an unforeseen consequence. If we took the total cost of transportation, which include the cost to the environment, it was not completely unforeseen. And you could argue the same thing about industrialization in general. So there are unknowns, but I think ethical consequences of artificial intelligence, many of those questions we know. We may not know the answers, but we know the questions. So that would be my...
I have a specific question for you, Anita, but Robert, I think you want to jump in on that.
I just want to add that I think there is here also really an opportunity for Europe, because in some sense the question is, if we go forward, how do we involve citizens? In some sense, can we do this in a way? We're moving into a world that basically everything that's possible can be made and can be created. And then the question is, in which direction do you go? And can we do this as a scientific community in dialogue with citizens? And I think this is particular, a wonderful opportunity for Europe, which has a different model than other regions.
So, Anita, the question I wanted to ask you was sort of reflecting on what the gentlemen have said, and I think it was Robert mentioned that results are not necessarily incremental. So how does that work then if you're having to put political targets in place when you can't really predict a target when you might be able to solve a problem since it's not incremental? And then, reflect on how that would work in terms of justifying funding.
It's very, very difficult, actually, because sometimes we are very eager to put targets. What should be not necessarily the outcome, but the impact. And there are people who say that we should fund only research with impact or relevance. And then we, from the Ministry of Education, Science and Culture side, we say that there wouldn't be any impact or relevance of science or research if it is not of top quality. And we can't pre-order the outcomes or the results. And this is the big issue with all the governments. There are so many needs for public money. With aging nations, for example, here in Europe, it is a very big issue whether you put the money for the care of the elderly or whether you put it for research, for example. And then the sustainability. When we started to fund Professor Markku Kulmala about 25 years ago, and he did his measurements in Hyytiälä, and now he's the world's most cited scientist in his field. And now we are trying to think with him and to help him to think how to make best use of those technologies and data in order to save the planet, more or less. So there's a kind of dialogue we need with our scientific community, because not everybody is ready to think how to make money and how to make use of all the results and outcomes for the benefit of societies and the planet. So the dialogue you mentioned, everybody, is of utmost importance. And sometimes from the government side, being a civil servant, we are used to all kinds of tones used in debates with us, but sometimes I pity the politicians because they are a bit shy in front of scientists, like there are so many of you in this room, because they feel inferior to knowledge and understanding and intellect. And in order for us all to avoid the unintentional consequences, we really have to pay attention to social dialogue, and also so that we could have more equity in societies. Because I can see that if we don't have more equal opportunities and people don't have access to scientific information and knowledge, they are turning more populist, and they are anti-research and anti-science. And this is something that we couldn't foresee happening, because I thought that we are all progressing countries and EU is just progressing all the way. But some points we have missed. Science and technological development have taken vast steps, but are people falling behind? We do not understand any longer who's in the driver's seat.
Well, let me pick up on that. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think that's so important, really it is. Not just in a societal sense, but science needs educated people to join science. Now, many people argue as to when the education is most important. The universities will say it's at university. I'm not so sure. Many people don't get to university, and actually if the people are poorly educated when they come, there's not a lot the university can do with them in the sense that we're talking about. So I would vote, if I was a politician, I'd vote for secondary education as one of the most important adjuncts to getting the value out of discovery, passionate discovery science, and feeding that engine. I think it's such an important point.
Thank you, Sir Peter, because this is just the way we actually think. We put a lot of emphasis now on early childhood education and then the comprehensive education and upper secondary education, because you can't do anything. You don't have top-level researchers if you fail the basis of education. And we have now set goals for raising the educational level of the whole population. So we should have 50% of higher education graduates by 2030. We now get 42%. And also we are increasing the compulsory school living age. And this is a big thing. It has been much debated, but it is really the question of the sustainability of societies also. So this is really, and we got the same advice from our academician who's a physicist, and he said that if I should decide where to put money in education, I would probably put it in early childhood education.
Robert.
Well, I think it's such an important theme, because one thing we know for absolutely certain, that science will progress and it will speed up. And by definition, it will be more detailed, it will be more complicated. So on the one hand, we run the risk that people will not understand what's happening, but at the same time, because of all these details, it becomes incredibly effective and will start to impact our lives more and more. So there's a nightmare scenario where science and technology governs everything, but nobody understands anything about it. And I think that is something that we have to address. And I think we can, not by sharing all the latest details, but explaining how science works. Yes. People can understand the scientific method. They do understand that this is not something that we make up. There is a whole method to do this. And I think this is something we can learn at a very young age. Even like preschoolers can understand basic logic. So I think that's something we should invest in, because we should realize that whatever is Europe decides or other countries decide, there's a certain force in science and technology that's unstoppable, I feel.
So with respect to frontier research, there is one other aspect to science that often doesn't get on the radar screen, especially in political circles or even at the society level. The funding agencies like ERC or the National Science Foundation in the US are one of the very few entities in the world that provide support to do something just because it pushes the bounds of human intellect, not because it has any immediate commercial value for the foreseeable future. For example, NSF supported Robert's colleague at Princeton, Andrew Weil, for 14 years to solve Fermat's last theorem. And he eventually did. And not because there was any translational value to that work, but because it had not been solved for several hundred years. And I think it's very important as a society, just like we invest in art, we have to focus on something because it challenges the human brain to a level that otherwise nobody else will fund. And in fact, this is the founding mission of the National Science Foundation. It is the responsibility of the government to support fundamental research. And this is what created the National Science Foundation.
Okay, you're certainly challenging people. I'm seeing a lot of engagement online. No questions as yet. Just to remind you that you can do that using the hashtag. But let me pick up on something, Anita, you sort of alluded to, and you're all very positive. It's all very glass half full up here on this stage. But out in the wider world, there is, we see picked up in the media, a tendency at the moment to anti-science. You know, we've heard senior politicians in the UK saying things like no one wants any more experts. You see a rise of an anti-vaxxer movement. You see climate change denial. Does that impact on researchers coming into their field or in trying to choose what field they would go into? Is it having an impact on younger researchers who are maybe trying to justify or find their place in the scientific community? Does anyone want to take that?
One thing I do see for the younger generation, I think, is very positive. They're passionate about research, but I see also many, many young scientists that are passionate about communicating their research and play a role in society. So almost the cultural value of science and the societal impact is equally important. And by the way, this effect that you just alluded, that this kind of anti-science bias, you can study that again using scientific methods, right? There are social scientists who study this. And one thing we learn is that if you grow up in an environment where you're being challenged at an early age, making decisions yourself, having more than one voice to listen to, it actually stimulates your engagement, etc. So I think it's something that science itself can address. And I think we as scientists can actually play a role here. One way to bridge that gap between where we are and where most of society is to reach out to society and build bridges, islands that you can jump over. And I think this is something that we have to do. So I think the mission, part of it, we can blame society. I think it's not good enough. I think it actually also just means that the mission of the scientific community also includes building these new engagements.
Okay, let's come back again to the sustainability goals and this issue that we're going to really try and hammer home. How should society and how should we react to the concept of disruptive innovation? Because disruptive, by its nature, might put people off. This is something we see in the tech world. We've heard mottos like move fast and break things. Some of those things can't be fixed again afterwards in some cases. So how, what should be the sensible, pragmatic approach for, say, politicians, governments, or those making the big funding decisions? What should be their approach to it? What should be their priorities? Peter.
Well, I think you have to be right. We have all argued that discovery research brings the unpredictable good. It could not possibly be true that it would be all good. That would be illogical. So I think we have to admit the possibility that some of the things that we find out will have potentially adverse consequences. What do you do about that? Well, the same thing as you do about the good consequences. You look really carefully and try to spot them coming and be aware that they could come. It's very difficult to do more than that, but trying to pretend it couldn't exist, I think would be not true and disastrous. We simply have to accept that everything will have two sides to it. I'm pretty confident the upside is better than the downside, but I'm not confident that things can't ever go wrong.
What do you think, Anita? I'm thinking of things maybe like sandboxes as a pragmatic approach.
Disruptive technologies or development is very difficult for governments. We also organized a council for disruptive development or something like this. We followed the Danish example. But the thing was that none of us could even think what we should be talking in the meetings of that council. So disruption, and there are, of course, lots of discussion about AI and how it will change the world of work and the whole society. And then we had, okay, yeah. Well, the next big thing is really that because science is progressive, but definition and technological development is enormous, and AI could do anything if it was let to do, my colleague from the defense side said. So then the kind of political conclusion was that we really have to put more energy and funding to education policy, research and innovation, and this triangle to work better. And as you now say in Brussels that it is not any longer triangle, it is a square, because we have to take the social engagement so much more on board. So this is really something that, I don't know, there are no final solutions to social issues. There are bad things happening, bad consequences that we have to deal alongside with the advancement of science.
I think we should also be distinguishing science itself, research and technology, and the architecture in which it happens. So I'm less worried if this technology is being developed in an open environment where we share insights, where citizens, governments have an idea of what's going on. If it's like just behind the closed doors of an industry lab or a state that's very secretive, I feel less confident. So I think we should also think about the architecture in which we want to develop science. And here, actually, I think it's wonderful to see how in frontier research we have developed these kind of open architectures. There are many wonderful examples. Myself interested in particle physics. We have world labs. There are so many examples, I think, actually, in the scientific community, how we can do this in an open way. But I think we should discuss that part too, and I think this should be also an important driver for Europe. Can you combine these two things? Can you actually have the breakthroughs and the frontier research, but do it in an environment where society actually is part of the whole enterprise?
Well, you've raised two issues that I actually wanted to come on to. One is the internationals I mentioned, which we will move on to. But the second is, within architecture, is there a role for business? We've been talking a lot about public funding, but where do you see business fitting into frontier research?
So, my institution is an example of a university because of the small size of the country in Singapore and the ability to coordinate across government, academia, and industry. There is a unique opportunity to connect with industry in the context of discovery research. For example, we have a number of major companies that are located on our campus. So examples would be Rolls-Royce from the UK. Their largest university lab is on our campus. HP from Palo Alto in the area of additive manufacturing. We have Alibaba Research on our campus. Faculty and students work with industry in new and unique ways. This brings, at least in the context of academia, new and unique ways in which young people, students, can see the potential impact of the research on a much larger scale than what just a university can provide. And I think this is one of the possibilities which sort of goes back to, because it's pre-competitive, it can be open. And in fact, we introduce many of the companies that are located on our campus, they don't talk to one another. We introduce them because they're all interested in the same things. And so it gives us an opportunity to be the Switzerland among basic research organizations to bring them together.
And we need all the money, and we need to pool resources, both human resources and also financial resources from public and private purse. But obviously there are some things you do only in open environment, and then it is more or less with public money. Open data and open research and open innovation to some extent. But I would say that it is very important, especially for small economies. You just have to bring them close to campus, and it is, we can see that it is inspiring for young researchers also. And of course then you have to know the roles of both or all the parties. And there's a lot of speech about ecosystems. Not everybody likes the word, but still, and I think that they can prove really useful to pooling of resources and also at international level. So I don't think it's sort of contaminated money at all from the business side.
By the way, I think we can also get some inspiration of how certain companies believe in the future. I like to point out that Apple spent, I think this year, $14 billion in R&D, which is the same amount that the Netherlands spent. So, which just sets the scale. So I think certain companies definitely do see that R&D and research and technology is the future. In that case, the future of a particular company. But I think, as a continent, as a country, we should be similar inspired. And we should also be aware, and we haven't talked about this yet, aware of that, we have to spend huge amount of money. This is actually, it is a key priority. And I think, setting the right targets also in terms of the financial ambition, is very important.
Well, I mean, how important then is, you touched on it, the breaking down of different silos in this area? I think, is this what your colleague, Professor Cordova, was calling convergence research? How do you do that? How do you encourage that?
I think, so I'll give one example of a simple step we took. I find that the younger scientists who are coming out of universities today are intrinsically much more interdisciplinary, who can move across disciplines because of the opportunities they have, perhaps compared to their more senior colleagues. So here is one example of an experiment we did last year. We created a new postdoctoral program at our university, and the traditional model would be to provide funding to the professors, and the professors go recruit postdocs. So we try to turn it upside down. We fund the postdocs. We get a pool of talent from all over the world. We give the money to the postdocs. Let the professors compete to get the postdoc. That changes the dynamic completely, and the postdoc can choose any professor in any department, anywhere in the university, can choose multiple professors. So this year, for 12 of these positions, we had 894 applications from 72 countries. So this is an example of, this actually convinced me that there is so much talent out there that can move across disciplines than probably we give credit for.
Often joke that we talk about sustainability, but the natural resource that is most precious is free space and time to think. And actually, this is something that young scientists are really attracted by. I think it's the quality of their colleagues, the quality of the environment, but also the freedom to explore. And we should just admit that if we think about the future, that the future already is here in the minds of young scientists who have very definite ideas where they want to move into. And so this is this wonderful, precious resource that we can tap into.
I mean, also outside the realm of science, I mean, what about those sorts of silos? Because it occurred to me when we were talking about the unforeseen or unforeseeable consequences, that in some areas they had been foreseen by, for example, authors. George Orwell foresaw some of the things we were talking about. I mean, is there a discussion to be had about, moving away from that we're scientists, you're arts? Anita?
Well, this is interesting. When we reformed our university system 2010 completely, and the universities are now legal entities on their own, and they have responsibility for their own finances and all the matters much more autonomous than they used to be. Obviously, academic freedom was there by the Constitution of the Republic, but still they are stronger players now. And we put extra funding to technological research, quite a lot. And then there was the idea to create a strong university of the arts, so that we can see that the two autonomous forces molding societies are really science, technology, and science especially, and arts. And then also extra money was put to this university. And I think this is also very important, because it is about passion, as you said, and also about creativity. And I think ERC is doing a lot for the stronger and more autonomous universities in Europe. And this is what we actually need. And I would very much encourage everybody to make a point of the importance of autonomy and freedom of research. We know that things are not developing to the right direction, even within EU, and it is being challenged in a way that nobody could foresee. So this is also part of the deal, I think, that the governments and EU, we should use our institutional power to make sure that the universities in Europe are strong and they can really play an important role in kind of fostering this kind of research we are now talking about.
Well, thinking globally, Super said you had 72 countries involved. Are you, and this is to all of you, I mean, are you worried or scared that it's difficult to foster this kind of international cooperation with what we see some sort of increasingly protectionist behaviour in some countries? You know, Peter, we see Brexit happening, we see trade wars and some rhetoric coming from the US president that aren't exactly helpful. If these scientific breakthroughs will have value, I mean, do you have to fight against protectionist attitudes? Sorry, Robert.
Fortunately, rather little, I think, and actually I'm rather confident that we won't, and if we do have to fight, that we'll win. Communication is important, though, and I've alluded to it. Communication of science among scientists is really important. It's not that straightforward to have ideas. For whatever reason, if I'm talking to you, often we'll ignore something that ought to be obvious to both of us. So we actually need to meet in a sort of protracted or prolonged way, not just a chance meeting that will spark off an idea. So the real problem is how do you draw? We've argued for knowledge's sake. Knowledge is king, and we've been asked to do better than that, I guess. So how do we extract the value from that knowledge? And you have hit the key. How do we bring different pieces together to get what we want? How do we get to the frontier of knowledge, which is now so vast it's difficult to do, with sufficient breadth to see the other opportunities or to interact with other people who might see the opportunities? Those are really difficult things. They need education. Education is key to it. But we need, I think the innovation is in new forms of interchange. I don't think that the political currents, which I disagree with, will actually disrail us. I'm reasonably optimistic and confident on that one.
It's wonderful to see that globalization actually does work in science. And I just reminded me, we saw a wonderful example this year. I was here in Brussels in April when we saw, it was also the press conference launching this first picture of a black hole. And of course the only way that picture could have been taken is by building a telescope the size of the planet. So this is like one of these moments where everybody else would give up, but scientists do not. And they connected all these telescopes around the world, prayed for 4 days of clear weather all around the world, and they got it, and then they got this wonderful image, which actually went viral around the world too. So first of all, we see scientists can collaborate, but also the world comes together. It's very rare that there's actually a bit of news, positive news, that's on all the front pages of all the newspapers in the world. And this picture was there. So I think it actually made a real true contribution to this fact that we're living on one planet. And if you talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and the sustainable Earth, obviously that's a problem that can only be addressed if we do it worldwide. So I think actually I look at science and technology and these challenges as a great counterforce for these much more nationalistic feelings that are coming up.
Despite the transient headwinds with respect to anti-globalization, etc., I'm quite optimistic. I should define what an optimist is. So let me define what a pessimist is. Somebody said a pessimist is somebody who looks at both directions before crossing a one-way street. I just look in one direction before I cross a one-way street. I think science has always played a very important role. So let me give a couple of examples, even today in the current climate, the role of science. When the US government decided to entrust the entire operation in the continent of Antarctica for all of the US government, for all of the agencies, they went to the National Science Foundation. So just like as Franz was mentioning, when I became the director of the National Science Foundation, I did not realize that I was responsible for signing a lot of the things that pertain to the continent of Antarctica involving 51 countries. Science was entrusted with that responsibility in the US government. When the U.S. government created the Small Business Innovation Bureau, SBIR program, it was not given to the Department of Commerce. The first agency to do SBIR was the National Science Foundation. So there are many, many examples of this where science was used as a vehicle for diplomacy, as a way to engage parties that would otherwise not come to the table. So I'm quite optimistic that in the long term, that will continue to prevail.
So I'm very pleased to hear that the gentlemen are very optimistic, but I'm one who looks both ways on a one-way street before I cross it, definitely. And I would say that let us all be agile what is happening, because there are different kinds of, you said about the architectures, also for science and research in some parts of the world. So we need to be very adamant in our business so that we use science and research for the good of everybody and keep it as open as possible and communicate and make sure that the social engagement is part of the package.
Okay, I have got a question from Twitter. It's for Robert, and it's from Patrick Fitzgerald. And he asks, is the barrier to accessing the free space in our minds to create the future caused by humanity's constant distraction from social media? I am not, the irony of me reading that out from Twitter is not lost on me. But if you could...
I think it's a good point. Yeah. I think actually that this is true for everyday life, but I think it's also true for the life of scientists. I think they live a much more fragmented life. They spend a much more time doing administration. In fact, if you look at, if you would be a politician, you would ask, are you better off than the previous generation? For scientists, you can actually measure this. And roughly, life for the previous generation was twice as good in terms of opportunities, etc. So I think we must be very much aware of this. In the end, we live in a world with wonderful challenges, great talent, but we have to create the space for all these young people that actually want to have a role in science. So it's not only, I think, the social media that are distracting you. And I think actually this I would love economists to calculate the value of a 1 hour of free thinking, but it must be very high. And I noticed that if we talk about this, it's important for scientists, but actually this theme is resonating also with other parts in the world. It's in people in industry, people in education. I think it's something that we have to be aware of. And again, it has to do with what is the structure, how do we build the architecture of academia. And I think we need some more I often joke, we need high ceilings, we need a space for thought bubbles.
I think picking up Robert's point, distractions come in many forms, and social media is one form of distraction. You could argue that the success rate of NIH and NSF, I don't know what the success rate is for ERC. At NSF, it's about 17 to 20%. So you have to write 5 proposals as a young scientist before you get your first proposal funded. A few years ago, we did a study in Washington of how much time do scientists spend in the process of pursuing science, but the time they spend has nothing to do with science. It's about 41% of the time is spent either chasing the money or justifying the funding that they already have or doing something else that has nothing to do with creative work. So I think it's a necessary part of doing this because, as I said before, it's taxpayer-funded money. It's up to us to justify it. But on the other hand, what is the right amount to justify? It's unclear. So social media is just one distraction of many.
And a key word, I think, is also confidence. Society should have confidence that people who have the excellence and have the ideas, that they're actually willing to spend every minute of their lives doing that research. And I think that is crucial to go forward.
Peter.
I don't have a problem with writing grants, with all respect. They bring ideas to me, to other people. I think we have to be able to explain ourselves. I think we should be able to explain ourselves. We can't have everything. It's part of what we do. I do have a problem with excessive peer review. Constantly being asked to prove that you've done good or this or your metrics of that. Peer review reinforces prejudice. And the real problem with my passion research is that people will form a club and they think that and argue that what they do is the most important thing, and they peer review each other's articles, they give each other A+, and go on and on and on. And if I had a complaint as a politician, it would be that. The paradox is that peer review is reinforcing these prejudices, but every so often we need to be disruptive. And actually that's what I regard my role as a clinician, which I am, at the Francis Crick Institute. It's just a bit of a different experience. Just gets people out of that rut that this is the most important thing. But peer review, sadly, does the reverse. It also takes an enormous amount of time to fill in and justify what you've done, which is all looking backwards. Grant writing, actually, is looking forwards. It might not always come off, but I think we have to bear some things.
I'm sure it's only a matter of time before the algorithms can write the grants applications for you. Let me say, actually, since we've touched on that, a little bit, I talk about diversity, because there's under 30% of women applicants for ERC calls. And, you know, I mean, are we systemically leaving out sections of society? Do you think that's a problem? I mean, what about diversity of people applying for grants? Is there something that could be done to make it more inclusive?
We are actually now reviewing the Academy of Finland, which is our research funding agency, to see whether the indicators or criteria they use are for the benefit of diversity. And this is a big thing, because we actually lose a lot of talent, especially in technology and innovation, especially. And I think this is something that, again, at the EU level, we should make sure that we don't have this kind of procedures or traditions which are not taking us forward, but repeating the past. And what I hear, Sir Peter was talking about the grant writing, is the same message from the Academy of Finland, that it is actually quite useful many times, and growing criticism against peer review, which is somewhat alarming because it is used also in so many ways at many places as basis for the grants.
And then I'm going to have a last question for all of you, so, but go ahead, Subra.
On the issue of diversity in science, I mean, this is nothing new. It has been said many times before. I think if the same problem, challenging problem, is looked at by very diverse groups, the chances of finding a more creative solution is much higher than any one homogeneous group looking at the same problem, whether it's all male, all female, all white or all black, it doesn't matter, all Asian, it doesn't matter. So that's one. There is a second reason, again, I don't know the numbers for Europe, I know the numbers for the US. About 71 to 72% of all the valedictorians in American high schools, both public and private, are young women. They also excel in mathematics and science. And that's an enormous amount of talent. If that is not represented in research, we are losing a lot of that talent from the scientific workforce, if you will. And I think, to me, those two are compelling enough factors. And I suspect Europe is not that different compared to North America. So to me, those two are compelling factors to emphasize this.
I think it's definitely gender, and I think in some sense, again, that's a theme that's very much kind of in the air right now. But there's, of course, also other underrepresented minorities. And so I think it's very important to realize that it's indeed not about equality. Something it's about equity. It's not enough to say the door is open for everyone, but you have to realize that some people have to take a very different path, more difficult path, it's something I think that as an academic community should be aware of, and it asks our attention. And I think it's coming in Europe. I must say, actually, in the US, this culture is, these themes are very much alive. And I think perhaps here we can also learn in Europe from some of these approaches.
Okay, final question then to you all. I want you to get your crystal balls out and tell me what new frontier is the most exciting for you that you can imagine. And I'm not even putting a time frame on it. What's getting your pulse racing, Peter?
What's getting I didn't quite catch the question.
What new area of frontier of science is most exciting for you?
In biological science?
In anything at all. It's a wide open question.
I'm going to talk in biological science. Well, I guess it's been new for me to go to the Francis Crick Institute. I'm really interested in genome integrity. I think this is going to explain all sorts of things about the aging process, about the disease processes, and go way beyond what they ever thought when they were looking at basic biochemistry of that and its relevance to cancer. So that's my pick.
Perfect. In a nutshell?
In a nutshell, I think it's quantum for me. The fact that we are now at a point where we are using the same technology that nature uses. Without quantum, we would just not sit in these chairs. We wouldn't be able to explain any property of any material. And of course, for a long time, this was just a theoretical concept that you struggle with. It was seen almost like a bug. And now I think it's becoming a feature. And we see it everywhere around us. So I think that's extremely exciting.
For me, I think it's two areas that are converging together. One is going to the smallest of size scales, almost at the atomic scale. We can see phenomena that we don't see at micro or macroscopic scales. For example, last year we discovered that you can actually bend diamond like you can bend a piece of metal. And that can happen only at a certain size scales. The other related exciting thing to me is the way in which different fields are converging because of the ability of fields such as machine learning, but coupled with good physics, to address problems that hitherto have not been addressed properly.
And Anita?
I really leave this to these gentlemen and other researchers, scientists in this room. Definitely, I don't have that kind of crystal ball. I will continue to listen to the wise advice from the scientific community.
Thank you very much. And for myself, I think I'm just really hoping for a cure for the common cold right now. But thank you very much, all of you. Please do join me in thanking the panel.
So thanks very much to our four fantastic panel members, and also to Jennifer Baker for taking us through that fascinating discussion. We're going to move on now to the next part of our programme this evening. We wanted to give you the opportunity to hear from some of our grantees, so researchers who are working with ERC grants. We have some 9,000 fantastic researchers that are or have worked with ERC grants. Of course, we couldn't invite them all here this evening. So we had to whittle it down to four. We have four grantees who are going to present to you briefly the kind of research they're doing with support from the ERC. They're working across the three scientific domains where the ERC offers grants, from the physical sciences and engineering, the life sciences, social sciences and humanities. They hold different kinds of grants, advanced grants, starting grants, proof of concept in some cases. And they're also looking at issues related to sustainability from different angles in their research. So I'd like to begin by inviting on stage Professor Wolfgang Lutz, who's affiliated to three academic bodies in Austria, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and the University of Vienna, where he is a professor of demography.
Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me to this important event and giving me 7 minutes to talk about two ERC grants. Actually, my first one was entitled Forecasting Society's Adaptive Capacities to Climate Change, a very ambitious effort, as I will illustrate. And now, just in the middle of another one that is even more ambitious, entitled The Demography of Sustainable Human Well-Being. There's no need to talk about climate change. You're all aware of this. And this week in Madrid, our politicians are again trying to find solutions for the mitigation, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But there is also a need for adaptation. Prepare, because there is already climate change going on, and some at least 2 degrees, if not 3 degrees, seems almost certain. So we have to face the issue of adaptive capacity. Now, many scientific studies, when they look at what could be the climate in, let's say, in West Africa in the year 2070 and how that would affect malaria mortality, what these people do, they take the climate of the future and match it with today's society. And this is silly in a way, because we know that societies are changing and their public health capabilities and societal institutions will be different. But do we have an analytic handle of forecasting society's adaptive capacity? So there has been this shared socioeconomic pathways as an approach to it that is now widely used in the climate change community, where we both have the challenges with respect to mitigation as well as the socioeconomic challenges for adaptation. So I just show you this process of that we call demographic metabolism, and I illustrate this with the EU's youngest member countries. So here you find an age and education pyramid, like women to the right, men to the left, and then sorted by age. And actually, color gives you education. So in 1970 in Croatia, there were quite some elderly people, particularly women, who had no education whatsoever. Then primary is yellow, secondary light blue, and tertiary dark blue. And then when we go over time, 20 years later, everybody will be 20 years older. You sort of shift this up, and society changes through the generational replacement. And we've done this for all countries in the world, also into the future. So that is the basic demographic instrument that we've developed and call demographic metabolism as societies change through generational change. Now, why education? I mean, there's a long story to it. Social scientists tend to see education just as a dimension of socioeconomic status, something that you either inherit or that is attributed to you, while age and sex are seen as sort of physiological elements that are embodied in us. Well, we've spent quite some effort to try to actually prove the causality of education to our health-related behavior, to the fertility, the birth rate, which of course is important for demographers, and all kinds of other behavior. You may have heard about Eric Kandel, who got the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2000, and I had the opportunity for some interactions with him. And he really makes it very clear that education, every learning experience, particularly in early childhood, as was said, but also throughout your life, builds new synaptic structures in our brain, and particularly if we reinforce it, if we repeat it for a second and a third time, this insight, he says, then when you walk out through this door, you're physiologically a different person than we came in. Your brain structure has changed for the rest of your life. So education is really something that's embodied and that causally affects our behavior, and it has all kinds of consequences. Essentially, it changes to less risky behavior. We are better aware. We are more forward-looking, have a longer personal planning horizon. We are faster in learning from past damage. There are with many studies along this. And then, of course, which is more natural, that we get better access to relevant information. And typically, because of these higher skills, we also tend to have higher income, both at the individual and the household level. Now, as to fertility, world population growth clearly is one of the mega challenges of our time. Here you see for 57 developing countries the fertility rate of the average rate of the countries on the x-axis, and then you see the birth rates, number of children for education level. Now, Ethiopia, for instance, a country that where women without education have 6 to 7 children, women with some secondary education only have 2 children. So, and there is causal stories behind this, that really female education is the key driver for declining fertility and curbing world population growth. And when we had sort of a review article on this topic, integrating the education and population in the notion of global human capital. We gave some two extreme scenarios using identical education-specific birth rates. We assumed the most pessimistic education scenario, no new schools being built, constant enrollment numbers. And you see the red area actually expands over time, because in Africa you have population growth but no new schools, so you will have more uneducated people, and world population already reaches 10 billion by mid-century. And if we have sort of the fast track following the Singaporean example, which really has been the country in the world that has the most rapid educational attainment distribution, from very low, almost complete illiteracy in the 50s, now to some of the best educated young cohorts in the world. You see this blue area expanding, and as a consequence of the lower birth rates for the more educated women, you see already 1 billion less by mid-century. So there is sort of the world population challenge. Now, we did this big series of studies on also trying to understand what are the drivers of longevity. Of course, medical research plays a major role, but what are the socioeconomic drivers? And conventional wisdom says it's increase in living standards that historically, as well as in developing countries today, causes the decline in death rates. And we found out, no, actually educational attainment, the cognitive empowerment associated with education, is clearly more important than the income. And summarize this in a slogan, so to say, when it comes to survival, mind matters more than money. Sounds great for a scientific institution. Of course, ERC needs both good minds and some money to fund the research. What about adaptation to climate change? We did a series of case studies all around the world trying to see what are the factors that make groups of people less vulnerable to disasters, natural disasters that are sort of typical of what will come with more climate change in the future. And you know that there is the Green Climate Fund. It's currently also discussed in Madrid, $10 billion per year. What is this money spent for? Well, if you look, it's mostly engineering projects. Our findings are, well, some, of course, adaptive engineering projects are important, but more important is the universal education of the broad population, to be informed of the risks that are coming and then being able to flexibly react, because we do not yet exactly know what kind of climate change in what specific part of the world will happen. So we had this title here in Science, Universal Education is Key to Enhanced Climate Adaptation. The subtitle was given actually by Science magazine, Fund More Educators rather than Engineers, and I had quite some angry calls from engineers. But I told them they should not just get all the money, give some money to the educators. Actually, education spending globally is declining. We've summarized this in several books. I just wanted to point on the right-hand side, actually this April, we presented something in Brussels with the JRC, the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission. You see the European Commission logo. And there were many other DGs, so this is directly feeding into anything DG Development, DG Internal Affairs, migration issues are directly addressed in some of our research here. Now, my new project that I'm now 2 years into has this demography of sustainable human well-being. And we started with developing an indicator of well-being that then can serve as a sustainability criterion in the way that it does not decline for any subpopulation over time, even if you factor in feedback from environmental change. GDP per capita has been the dominant well-being indicator, but we all know about the shortcomings, and then there are many, many others. So we had 6 criteria according to which we define some, and the result is something we call years of good life. So it's based on life expectancy, because it seems logical, but not all indicators acknowledge this, that in order to enjoy any quality of life, we have to be alive. Sounds logical, but we need to have the length of life in there. Otherwise, I think it's always optimal to kill the weaker people and so on, to increase the average. So, and then, but mere survival is not enough. So we have to somehow see what is a good life. And there's one research community looking at subjective well-being and the other at objective indicator. And we sort of blended this, but having years are only counted as good years if you are both about a minimal threshold in subjective life satisfaction and in 3 criteria of objective: being out of absolute poverty and being physically and cognitively not disabled. Well, time is over, and we've done this now for many countries in the world, and just as a tribute to the Finnish EU presidency, I wanted to show some long-term time series that we did for this quite remarkable Finnish development. In the late 19th century, Finland was one of the poorest corners of Europe. They had the latest non-war-related famine in Finland in 1868, with a quarter of the children dying. And since then, it has become one of the most developed countries of Europe, and although the happiest one now, according to the World Happiness Report. So you see life expectancy, the bloodline, and the years of good life catching up with life expectancy, but not completely, because now population aging always resides in a certain number of people with disability at old age. But you see continued progress there in this indicator of quality of life. Now I'm coming to a conclusion. Now, I was one of the 15 independent scientists who were asked by the UN Secretary General to produce the Global Sustainable Development Report 2019, which we presented to the UN General Assembly in September. It's called "The Future is Now." It's not something in the distant future. It starts now. And the subtitle, and quite almost half of the discussions go on science for achieving sustainable development. So here, this is quite a step for the UN, because it's the first time such a high-level report is a non-negotiated document. No government can tell us what we say. It's our scientific input, and a lot of ERC-funded research went into this. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Lutz. So our next speaker is Sarah McCormack from Trinity College, Ireland, who holds an ERC starting grant. She's been working on solar energy for some 15 years or more, and her special area of interest in her research is something I think which will be of interest to all of us living in Belgium, because she's looking in particular at how to improve the efficiency of solar energy in countries with cloudy weather. So we look forward to hearing from you, Sarah. Thanks.
Okay, so often people are surprised whenever they hear that I'm a solar energy researcher, particularly because Ireland isn't really well known for its sunny skies, but maybe more well known for its Guinness. So what we're trying to do, or what I'll tell you a bit about tonight, is how we're working towards trying to make those cloudy skies more efficient in terms of energy generation. And this is our European Research Council project based on plasmonic luminescent solar devices. So often we talk about resources whenever we discuss renewable energy, but for solar energy this isn't the case. So the Earth receives more energy from the sun in 1 hour than we use in a year. So of course we have an issue with distribution, we have an issue with efficiency, and of course with cost. So how do we try to change those things and improve those things? So one of the things that we try to do in terms of improving the efficiency of solar energy is through solar concentration. This is a solar energy power plant that you can see from Seville, and it's generating about 11 megawatts of power. So of course this is very nice if you have direct sunlight. And this is where you have the sun in the sky, and you can see it clearly, bright, clear, sunny days. But sadly, this isn't something that we all have across the world, and particularly for Europe, and particularly for Dublin. So we have about 65% of our solar radiation is diffuse, and that means that it's coming from all angles. So it's very difficult to concentrate that sunlight. So this is what we're working towards, and the way that we do that is through luminescence. So I have the device an example of one here, so hopefully you can see even at the back that the edge is quite bright there. So even under these very low light conditions, it's able to capture that light, and because of the difference in the refractive index between the air and the polymer material, the light's trapped in there. And by total internal reflection, it bounces around and it comes out at the edge. So for solar concentration, what we do is we try to capture that light at the edge, the sparkle that you can see, I hope, and we try to collect that using solar cells to generate electricity. And we do that using laser dyes, and we also use quantum dots, which are semiconductor nanomaterials. So these are able to absorb different parts of the solar spectrum depending on their size. So much smaller particles are able to absorb down in the UV, and then as we move into the longer wavelength, we're using larger particles. So this is the type of device that we could see, where you would have multiple types of these devices. So different colours here absorb different parts of the solar spectrum. So we're able to put these together to be able to collect the light at the edge and then generate electricity for use in our buildings. So another application of this is using luminescent downshifting layers. So while for the solar concentrator we're collecting light at the edges, for the downshifting layer we're making very, very thin layers, and we're trying to collect that light underneath. So we're trying to allow the light to penetrate down in through the material and then absorbed by the solar cell underneath. So essentially what it's trying to do, it's a purely optical approach, so it's not interfering with any of the cell architecture. And this is quite nice because we can tune the material then to suit any type of solar cell. So essentially what it's doing is it's absorbing the UV sunlight and then downshifting that or re-emitting that into the visible range of the spectrum, where most solar cells are more efficient. So these types of layers can work very well whenever we're looking at organic cells or perovskite materials, whenever the UV has an issue or it starts to degrade the cells. So instead of a UV blocker, we can use these types of layers. But the problem, of course, is, and there's always problems, this is why we have research, is how do we fix some of the losses in here? So we have losses in reabsorption, where we have the luminescent species absorbing and re-emitting in the same range. We also have scattering within here as well, and we have some escape cone losses, and that's where we have light leaving the top surface of the material. So what the ERC project has allowed me to do is investigate how can we reduce these losses overall. And in doing so, we've been investigating this plasmonic interaction. So I was told before not to go into this in too much detail. So what this is doing really, we're introducing metal nanoparticles into these devices. And what it does is whenever light is incident on these particles, it starts to oscillate. And these oscillations can lead to increases in the efficiency of our luminescent species, depending on the distance. So this is very nice to try to enhance these types of devices. It reduces the reabsorption, of course, and the escape cone losses and the scattering. This is some of the results that we've had. So this is the first plasmonic luminescent solar concentrator. You can see it's quite small at the moment. It achieved a 60% increase whenever we compared it with a luminescent concentrator without our plasmonic enhancement. So we're very happy with that. And then in terms of the plasmonic downshifting layer, so we've achieved a 9% increase in silicon efficiency and an 18% increase in the cadmium telluride efficiency. So this, of course, is dependent on the efficiency within that UV region. So where you have a low response in the UV region, then this is where these layers can really help and try to improve that efficiency overall. The software that we've been building through this grant has enabled us now to be able to optimize these devices so that we can start to build larger ones, so we can fabricate them for facades and buildings, and this is where we see this application going. And this is one of our small devices that we've started to optimize. And the main thing here is that we look at the morning and the evening. So really this is where our diffuse light is highest. So when you're comparing with their direct light, of course the solar cell is working very well. But whenever you have the 65% diffuse or these cloudy skies, particularly in Dublin, then you can start to see how these devices can work and improve the efficiency overall. So we're very excited about that. And now what we're working on is the optimization of these devices. So how do we get them into buildings? So essentially what we're looking at is using something like this as a glazing. So where you would have this as your glazing, and in the frame we have our solar cells. And the solar cells then are collecting our electricity or generating our electricity in the frames, which are then fed into the buildings. Another option is where you have a reflector on the back. So now no longer is it a glazing material, because now you can't see through it, but the material is being reflected back in, so now it's a solid coloured facade. So of course the efficiency would be higher, but of course you're losing that your design choices whenever you're installing these types of systems. So here you can see some of the facades here, these coloured facades. I took one of these photographs on the walk here to this earlier on today. So now whenever you see buildings with coloured facades and coloured glazings, hopefully in a few years' time at the end of this project, you'll start to see them, and they won't just be pretty colours and pretty facades, they'll also be generating electricity. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So our next speaker is Anne McGurran from the University of St Andrews. Her research focuses on biodiversity, and one of the key results is an open access biodiversity database, which is a fantastic resource both for researchers and conservation managers. And Anne holds both an advanced grant for her Biotime project and a proof of concept grant for her BioChange project.
This lady is, excuse me. Excuse me. This lady is Mary Somerville, who's illustrated on a Scottish banknote. She was an incredible woman. She was self-educated. She was born at the end of the 1700s. She became a very famous scientist. Somerville College in Oxford is named after her. But the reason I'm telling you about her today is that she grew up in Scotland on the Firth of Forth. And she wrote an autobiography in which she talks about the Firth of Forth, about looking out to sea and seeing shoals of herring rippling the surface of the water and whales spouting in various directions. This is a view from our cottage on the Firth of Forth today, and I can assure you that there are no shoals of herring rippling the surface and no whales spouting either. So big changes in biodiversity. This is something which Daniel Pauly, the famous fisheries scientist, has called the shifting baseline. Our perception of what biodiversity is like depends on our own experience. And if I think about my ancestors, this is my great-grandmother's family in Ireland at the end of the 1800s, or even of myself, and this is me here picking up shells on the beach, we have a very different perception of what biodiversity is like from children today. At the same time, there's a sense that biodiversity is ecstatic. Conservation of nature, conservation of museums, has this idea that we keep the same thing in the same place in perpetuity. This is a museum at the University of St Andrews, and these stuffed animals have been there forever, really. Conservationists often have the idea that nature should be the same. The species are static, and we find exactly the same species in the same place over time. In fact, as we already know, this is not true. And one person who realised that it wasn't true was Charles Darwin. When Darwin was writing Origin of Species, he actually realised that changes in the abundances and the types of species in a particular place was what was driving natural selection. It's also an idea which is very important in ecology, and it's the idea that I drew on when I put together my proposal for my ERC Biotime grant, which I'm absolutely delighted the ERC funded. Now, the idea in this grant was to try to understand how much these ecosystems were changing through time. And I investigated that in two ways, or two main ways. The first was through a study of rivers on the island of Trinidad in the Caribbean, and the second was by putting together a big database of communities which had been studied by ecologists for a number of years. Now, in terms of our Trinidadian data, we had a number of different streams in Trinidad's northern range, and these are some of my colleagues doing the sampling. We sampled fish and invertebrates and microscopic plants as well. Our big database now covers over 50,000 species from 60,000 locations and a variety of different taxa, as shown on this slide. And these are areas where have been surveyed in the same way over time for anything between 2 and 100 years. So it's a very large database. In fact, it's the largest one of this type that exists at present. So what did we find? In terms of the Trinidadian study, and this is river in Trinidad, we discovered that the sites had the same number of species roughly over time, but the types of species that we were seeing changed quite dramatically over time. And they were changing at a rate that exceeded what the best ecological theory predicted. So it was not just Darwin's amount of change that we were expecting, and we actually saw a much greater range of change than that baseline change. In terms of our big biotime database, we discovered the same phenomenon. The size of the communities is roughly constant through time. The types of species found there are being rearranged very rapidly. And we've discovered that the higher latitudes and the oceans are being rearranged much more rapidly than terrestrial or lower latitude systems. Now, you might say, everything changes, everything stays the same. Why does it matter? Should we care? Well, in fact, there are quite important consequences for the resilience of these ecosystems on which the world depends. And I can illustrate those by taking you very briefly to the west coast of Scotland. The area in the inset map, which is shaded, is surveyed every year very consistently to provide information for fisheries management. And we drew on that data, it's a nice 30-year time series, to analyse the trends in the fish populations. What we found was, once again, the same result. The numbers of species in these areas are very constant through time. There's very rapid rearrangement of species. But what we're finding here is that the types of species we're finding in the northern part of the range are becoming very similar to the types in the southern part of the range. This seems to be correlated with a shift in temperature. But what it means is that there's much less distinctiveness in the different parts of the ecosystem. And of course that's got implications for fisheries as well as for ecosystem function more generally. An analogy of this biotic homogenization would be the homogenization of shopping malls around the world. If we go to anywhere, Singapore, I'm sure, Brussels, Scotland, London, we will see the same brands dominating these shopping centres. The natural variety, the traditional variety of the different shops has been lost, and we find much less distinctiveness, much more homogenization. In the same way, our ecosystems are becoming homogenized. Now, as was mentioned at the start, the Biotime database is now an open access database for anyone, anywhere in the world to use for science, education, research, conservation. And we've already had 2,500 downloads by people in 68 countries. I'm going to finish up now with just 3 points. The three ducklings here remind me that there are 3 main take-home messages. The first one is that biodiversity is changing. It's not static anywhere. We need to factor this change into our analyses of these ecosystems and into our approaches for conservation. The second point is that we need to do much more than just count species. We need to consider how species are changing, or how the composition of species is changing through time. And the Biotime project has contributed to that through new methodology for measuring species diversity, and also helping inform the theory that we need to make better predictions about how ecosystems are changing through time. My third point is that although there's a lot of reason to be despairing about the fate of biodiversity, there's still hope, there's still time to make positive changes for the future. We're seeing rapid rearrangements of species, but as yet rather few complete losses of species. Species extinctions are still at a relatively low level. So if the world takes appropriate action, then there will be a nice state of the world's biodiversity to leave for future generations. So clearly, and this is my last slide, we're very focused on climate change, as you should be, but alongside that, we need to think about biodiversity change, and we need to take appropriate actions to preserve this wonderful biodiversity of the world around us for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. So our fourth and final grantee who will be addressing us this evening is Charles Barroux, who is affiliated with the CNRS in France. And Charles' area of research is related to microfluidics. He looks in particular at small droplets. You're going to explain to that what that is, us what that is, and the potential impact it might have on our health.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here with you tonight. So my first slide is about me. I am the only scientist in my family. I'm actually the only researcher in my family. But that makes me very special. Everybody keeps asking me about my work. What is it that I actually do? What do I do every day? And so in particular, This is my Uncle Joseph, and my Uncle Joseph is very interested about my work, and he keeps asking me, what is your research actually about? So I was very excited initially to tell him, my research is about tiny droplets. And it's true, it's about tiny droplets. These are droplets that you see. It's a very exciting new field of research that has been known for about 20 years, and that was known that it was going to transform healthcare, although nobody really knew how. But as a fluid dynamicist, it was very interesting to me because everything needed to be understood still. Things were very unclear about 20 years ago. So one of the problems that we addressed in my lab in this field of droplets is to think about how do you breathe when you're sick. So if you have a flu, you may have some mucus in your lung, and as you try to breathe, the mucus has to go through a complicated geometry. And one of the things that we learned is that the geometry of the lung actually has a very important effect about how things are transported in the different regions. And so I said this to my uncle, and he said, oh, so you're still working on droplets? And I said, yes, but now we've become really experts in droplets. As a matter of fact, we are such experts that we now know how to design particular geometries to do very complex operations. So, for example, by designing the geometry of our microchannels, we can make droplets. We can make them very, very fast and very robustly. And this is quite a unique way of making droplets. We can also design a different geometry now, not to make the droplets, but to hold them stationary, so that when we flow the droplets into our little plastic device, we can hold them in place and observe them for as long as we want. And so I was very, very excited. I told my uncle, look, we now have a huge toolbox. We have a unique toolbox, and we are the magicians of tiny droplets. And my uncle said, he said, how can anyone actually spend 10 years of their life looking at tiny droplets? It turns out this was about the period when I was actually writing my ERC grant, and my ERC grant actually was going kind of in the same direction. The questions I was asking in my ERC grant was, can we now not just make tools to manipulate droplets, but can we use these tools to manipulate biological materials, in particular cells? And the objective, if you make tools, is to have people using these tools. You don't want to make tools that people don't use. And so if you want to make tools that are actually useful to biologists, we have to be able to put them in their hands. And in order to convince them to use them, we have to show them how they can use them to learn new biology. And so this is what the RC project was about. And so the first thing that we did was not to put cells in droplets, but to put DNA. And so now by combining our tools, this is how the experiment really works. We could make droplets in parallel like this, and we could hold them in place like this. Except that now, instead of having just water and oil droplets, we have droplets that contain DNA and some kind of magic mix. And then we can use classical biochemistry techniques to amplify the DNA in each one of these droplets. And then you take these little devices, you put them on a microscope, and this is the type of image that you get. You get an image with 30,000 droplets. Some of the droplets are colorless, so you don't really see them. Some of them are blue, some of them are red, and some of them are yellow. And so by counting the number of red, blue, and yellow droplets, you can get very precise quantification of what was in your initial sample. Why is this useful? It's useful, for example, in oncology. If somebody has a cancer, instead of having to take a biopsy of the cancer to know if it's growing or decreasing, you can take some blood and detect DNA that's coming from the cancer. So this is called the liquid biopsy. You can play similar games by measuring fetal DNA in the blood of the mother, so potentially replace amniocentesis. You can play the same game with infectious diseases, but also beyond human health, you can also look at food safety, or you can look at environmental problems by being very, very precise on how you quantify the DNA. And so these tools are very robust, they're very easy to use. And so what we ended up doing is we spun out a company from the lab with the help of an ERC proof of concept grant. It's called Stila Technologies. It's based and manufactures in Paris. It has 65 employees and it sells worldwide. So just taking a step back, now let's go back to our initial idea, which was to put cells in the droplets. And so briefly I will tell you how we are doing this back in the lab. This is not the company, this is the lab. So usually when biologists work with cells, they put them in little plastic dishes, and this is what the cells look like. And so this cell over here doesn't really care what the cell is doing. They're mostly interacting with the plastic dish, at least mechanically. But what we know is that in a human body, the cells are actually touching each other, and they're actually communicating with each other through mechanical, chemical, or biological cues. And depending on how you organize the same cells, you get very, very different outcomes. That's good, yeah? Okay, so how are we doing this in the lab? Again, we have a little device, which is this big, which fits on a microscope slide. And what we're able to do is to use our droplet manipulation tools to make the droplets, guide them, and hold them in the same device. And now if we put cells inside of these droplets, and we let the cells sediment to the bottom, this is looking just at one of the little anchors in these devices. The cells, you can see the cells individually, and the cells start to interact with each other, and after a few hours, they make a very beautiful round sphere of cells, which we call a spheroid. And we're able to see very exquisitely the details in each one of these spheroids, but on a single one of these devices, we have several hundred of them. And so what we're able to do by using these microfluidic technologies with microscopy and with informatics, we're able to actually get a unique level of detail on the interactions between the cells, on many, many of these cells. And the idea then is that this mimics so well the human body that maybe one day it will reduce or replace or refine animal testing. So our objective, again, is to put these technologies in the hands of the users. So we have another proof of concept grant to actually allow different users from different institutes to actually use the technology for their own biological problems. And so my uncle then last year said to me, have you discovered anything interesting yet? And I will leave you with just a very brief idea of what I'm going to show him next time I see him. Next time I see him, I'm going to show him that we're working on cancer. We're able to make these spheres of cancer cells and put them in contact with immune cells. And this is one of the very exciting ways that we're going to treat cancer in the future, is to have your own immune cells attack the cancer. And what we're able to see in these devices is how the immune cells really recognize the cancer spheroid and how they actually kill those cells. And so to briefly finish about what we're doing in my lab, what we're doing is that, first of all, we're trying to understand the basic science. We're really working across disciplines. We're physicists, chemists, engineers, and biologists working together. And what our main aim is really to make the tools available to people outside our lab and hopefully to help improve people's health. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much to Charles and to our three other grantees who shared their research with us this evening. You've been very patient. I'm sure there are lots of questions you would love to ask them, but we're running a little bit late, and I think you'll all be with us upstairs for the reception afterwards. So there will be opportunities for networking and for exchanging on your research in the room upstairs afterwards. So I suggest we move on now to our closing session of this event, and I would like to invite on stage, first of all, Mr. Tomir Anticic, who is State Secretary for Science and Education of the Republic of Croatia. Welcome.
Good evening. Distinguished guests, dear ladies and gentlemen, it is my very great honor to be in this very esteemed company, which in many ways, in fact, is a Nobel Prize or Field Prize factory. And as you are, I'm sure, very well aware, we are faced today with ever-increasing societal, economic, environmental, and health challenges. In fact, some of the themes here were about that. And of course, it is only natural that research is directed towards finding solutions to these challenges. That way, of course, lies a sustainable future. However, it must be pointed out, and I believe, and from what I hear, I'm very much largely speaking to a converted audience here, is that long-term wise, in fact, true sustainability for Europe and the world lies in supporting the best ideas, the top scientists and the top innovators in their, perhaps, as has been pointed out, tractable and realistic, but curiosity-driven and bottom-up research. Because that is the only path to ensure relevance and leadership in the world today, where one can easily envisage that due to ongoing and, in fact, accelerating revolutions in science and engineering, the world will change proportionally looking, perhaps in the next 30 years, more than it has changed in the last 300 or 3,000 or 30,000 years. It is actually a really, really exciting time. And this is where, in fact, the importance of ERC is extremely, extremely important. So this is, yes, where ERC steps in. A science-driven funding mechanism committed to a high-risk, high-gain research funding, targeting new and emerging issues. ERC made the European research system a much more attractive place for top researchers, and consequently reversed brain drain in Europe, and in fact formed a brain gain all around Europe and some countries in particular. It's a great, great success. It is actually also very important to commend the great effort ERC has invested in closing the gap between research and innovation, and some of the talks here have been very, very interesting indeed. So the proof of concept, for example, grants enable delivering the frontier research results to the market much more efficiently than has been the case before. Moreover, for the newly introduced synergy grants, ERC provides opportunities for the immense progress of frontier knowledge. In this regard, and going to Croatia now a bit more, I'm very proud to say that Croatia got its new now synergy grant holder, and for Iva Tolic and Nenad Pavin. And also I'm actually very personally proud of this, as I used to be the head of an research institute, before I became a state secretary in Croatia, who in fact wooed Iva Tolic from Germany to Croatia. So I'm very, very happy about this reverse. No offense to Germany, but we're happy about that. Yeah. This in fact brings me to the upcoming Croatian presidency of the Council in the first half of next year, and also it emphasizes its priorities. Croatia will, of course, continue negotiations of the remaining outstanding issues in relation to the main programs, in particular in relation to Horizon Europe. These include primarily openness of the programs to third countries like Switzerland, Israel, UK. Don't mention Brexit, yes, okay. So, and as well as the budget, again. This will be to a very large extent an issue during the Croatian presidency. Also, we want to make synergies of Horizon 2020 with structural funds as flexible as possible, including, if possible, synergies with the ERC grants, Skills of Excellence and further on, in fact. A key theme of the Croatian presidency will be promoting the importance of brain circulation, defined as a two-way flow of highly skilled people, as opposed to the brain drain which Croatia and a lot of us at the EU 13 countries face and other countries face. In particular, the focus of the Croatian presidency will be on how to address the negative influence and how to maximize the benefits of brain circulation, striving towards as much as possible towards a symmetric mobility and reduce the heterogeneity of research systems in the different individual countries. So we want to focus on enhancing a balanced and fair brain circulation in Europe for the benefit of all its parts and the Union as a whole. We hope to set clear targets for this upcoming period in that regard. We strongly believe that it is in fact largely the responsibility of the individual nations for the brain circulation as opposed to brain drain, and that the quality of the national research systems and higher education systems is crucial to attracting and retaining high-quality researchers. With that in mind, so basically the emphasis should not be on just Horizon Europe, how that will help. One main reason, one crucial reason why a lot of these EU 13 countries, including unfortunately Croatia, are not as successful as all the members, the EU 15 ones, is in fact of the individual national systems. So it is only a question of funding partially, but it's actually also a question of very outdated higher education science systems, some of them which have not changed much from the 19th century even. So with that in mind, Croatia is currently working toward introducing a new and far-reaching act on higher education and science, with the goal to enable more international competitive science, focus on project-based success, in particular ERCs, fostering international mobility and creating conditions where the academia interacts much more easier with the high-tech economy than has been the case so far. Accordingly, the Croatian position paper emphasizes the first pillar of the future program, including increase of funding for ERC. So from the position of a small country and a new country, and unfortunately a modest innovator only, we can appreciate the importance of increasing investment in research and development, so we hope to see even more funds available in the following programming period for Horizon, in particular for ERC. We are proud to say that we have surpassed, our own 3 ERCs from FP7 with 5 ERC grants on Horizon 2020 so far, 3 in the past few months only. And I'm very happy to point out that out of these basically 8 ERCs, a large majority are women. In fact, I think 6 out of the 8. So very, very proud of that. The number, of course, should be much, much higher. And Croatia, in addition to as I said, the new acts, laws to change the safety of higher education, are introducing numerous measures for increasing participation in Horizon 2020, with special measures on increasing and supporting DRC grantees, giving additional funds, additional, permanent positions and such. What the idea is, to the best, give the most. So I will end with this, and I would like to wish Professor Jean-Pierre Bourguignon all the best in his extremely important work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, State Secretary. Now we're really very delighted to welcome the new Commissioner for Research, Innovation, Education, Culture and Youth, Maria Gabriel. And we're really delighted that you're able to come and join us here this evening at the beginning of your mandate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear President Bourguignon, ladies and gentlemen, Excellency. It's a great honor for me to be here. I'm always impressed by the talent that we have in Europe, by the good cooperation that we establish with other partners in the world. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here this night with you. As you already know, the new European Commission has taken office this week, and I'm really proud. I'm proud to be in charge of a portfolio that has a strong focus on knowledge and future-oriented policies. A portfolio that truly matters to our European citizens and at the same time contributing to delivering on Europeans' wider objectives. So today's event is a very good way to start in this new capacity. And to be very honest, I'm really very glad with the change of the title of my portfolio. So thank you very much. It was possible thanks to your mobilization, thanks to your very strong messages. But for me, there is a very strong significance, because for us Europeans, the word that means values, content, sense. And believe me, you can count on my firm support, not only to include research in the title of this new portfolio, but really, really to rely on you in order to tackle the main European challenges, in order to convince every European citizen how much the research, the frontier research is important if you'd like to offer some common answers to those challenges. So the theme of this event, A Sustainable Future for Europe, the contribution of frontier research is really highly topical. As you already know, the first headline initiative in this new Commission is the European Green Deal. And as expressed by our President von der Leyen, We aim at becoming the world's first climate-neutral continent by 2050 and to move forward a zero-pollution environment. But that means at the same time that this transition towards a competitive sustainability is a great challenge and opportunity. That's why we need all the brains, all the ideas in this endeavor. And I count a lot on you. Because we all know that the best investment in our future, and I would like to insist in our present, is the investment in our researchers, in our young people, in our innovators. That's why education, research, innovation, and behavior change will be key. Will be key if you'd like to demonstrate our ability to make the transition to a climate-neutral economy in a digital age. At the same time, thank you very much, Excellency, for the strong message. We are counting on the next Croatian presidency because it's very good to have ambitions. It's very good to have goals. But now, and first, we need to defend our budget. The budget for Horizon Europe, the budget for European Research Council. If you'd like really to fulfill with concrete content those ambitions. And you already know, we started with another mobilizations 3-4 weeks ago. There is for our people some encouraging news coming from the last days. That's not my case. It's not acceptable for me, any cut for Horizon Europe. So we need to continue. We need to stay as mobilized as possible in order just to show that if you'd like to tackle climate change, to provide answers for the digitalization, if you'd like to tackle the demographic changes, we need for that to invest in research and innovation. And that's why count on me. I will stay very firm in this endeavor because I fully believe that Horizon Europe framework program will make maybe the most important contribution. And at the same time, that's our guarantee to spread successful solutions across Europe. We would like really to see a Horizon Europe program which is a key enabler to accelerate the pace of the societal transition in synergies, yes, with other national and European programs. Talking about synergies, yes, it's a very beautiful word. My intention now, and I would like really to count on you too, is to transform those beautiful intentions and words in a concrete actions. With different tools, we can really achieve more. And yes, in Horizon Europe, we have 35% for climate change, but my intention is really to cooperate very closely with all the other commissioners in order to contribute and to show very clearly what is the contribution of research for the answers of those challenges. And here, in Horizon Europe, European Research Council will continue to have a very important role to play in pursuing groundbreaking frontier research. Radical new technologies and disruptive research and innovation are needed if you'd like to fuel this required societal transition. Yes, we are really proud, President Bourguignon. The European Research Council truly is a game changer. It has become the world's top funding agency, not only by the percentage of supported scientific papers, but for me what is really important is to see how it is the impact of ERC in generating scientific excellence, well known, and whether it is through highly cited top papers or Nobel Prize winners. Here I know that we have the honor to have some of them with us, and I already enjoy next week another one. So thank you very much. We are really very, very proud of you. And I'm, of course, excited that such a European success story falls within my remit. And I'm deeply committed to safeguarding this success. Because on one side, we don't have so much European success stories, are telling some of the people. But my answer is that no, we have success stories, European success stories, but we need to promote them, to make them more visible, and count on me to popularize what you are doing. And I would like to say here that Europe as a whole, as a continent, we need to strengthen our position in order to address the challenges in the future and in particular the sustainability challenges. So knowledge developed through ERC projects will allow us to understand the challenges at a more fundamental level and will provide us with future breakthroughs and innovation that we currently do not foresee. And let there be no doubt, bottom-up ERC-funded research also contributes to political priorities. We have already heard examples here today on how ERC-supported frontier research projects make a real difference in the area of sustainability challenges. And the projects increase our knowledge on sustainability, thereby contributing to a better understanding of the problems we face, and at the same time, you help us to increase our ability to solve them. That's why, clearly, investing in frontier research is an investment into the future. Frontier research has a great potential to improve people's lives and significantly accelerate efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and address climate change and the others common, our European challenges. So I would like also here to highlight that other speakers present today reflect the ERC global nature with representatives from across the world, and the ERC's global standing is clearly an asset for us, for Europe. It could pave the way for more international cooperation on sustainability issues of common interest. Much of this has been spearheaded by the ERC President, Professor Bourguignon, and this evening I especially want to pay tribute to the extraordinary work done by you. Your leadership as President has served to strengthen the excellent results and reputation of ERC. Thank you very much, President. Thank you for your energy, for your vision, for your commitment. And at the same time, today is a day to thank you for all you have done before to pass the baton to Professor Mauro Ferrari on the 1st January next year. I look very much to working with all of you, not only with the President, but all the others. So in concluding, I would like to underline that curiosity-driven, bottom-up research is essential in addressing the many complex and sometimes threatening challenges we are faced with today and in the future. Investing in the ERC is giving us hope that some of the daring ideas funded today will provide us with the solutions we need for tomorrow's challenges. So let us all support the groundbreaking frontier research that holds promises for the disruptive changes we need for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. So now we're drawing to a close, and I would like to invite on stage our President, Professor Jean-Pierre Bourguignon, to deliver the closing remarks of this event.
Dear Commissioner for Innovation, Research, Culture, Education and Youth, Cher Maria Gabriel, thank you very much also Tome Anticic for your engagement and also telling us where Croatia will take us. I still remember the visit of your institute in Zagreb. It was very interesting. In particular, meeting, of course, Iva Tolic, who is definitely a Croatian hero. She's a European hero. I was very pleased with this session, which had, as you understood, several components. Of course, very important roundtable, looking at the problem from a global point of view. By the way, during the roundtable, you noticed that several people brought up the issue that the solution is also in very basic critical education. So actually, your portfolio now, you have the two tools, so you cannot miss that. And I was very pleased because usually when I discuss with people, that's one thing I always bring up, namely that, of course, I'm a researcher. My natural community is the scientific community, but I think we should never forget the people who are shaping the next generation, namely the teachers. And from that point of view, I think this is something which too many countries actually are neglecting. And really priority for education cannot be separated from priority for research. I appreciated very much both of you had a very fighting spirit. I think we in a sense, are in a moment where we know there is not much time left for many things, and therefore the right decisions have to be really made very quickly. And I'm sure that the scientific community will be able to mobilize itself as it did, for example, not so long ago when the European Fund for Strategic Investment, which was certainly a great idea, but it was not a great idea to take away money from Marie Sklodowska-Curie Actions and ERC. But we managed to have this change, so I hope we continue with this same fighting spirit jointly. And because, of course, the previous fight was jointly with, actually, you probably know that, with Commissioner Moedas, but also Vice President Georgieva. So it was an interesting combination of efforts, and I think we succeeded in the end. So, ladies and gentlemen, it has been, I think, a very great moment of listening to high-level scientists. I don't want to finish without thanking our grantees who came and contributed to show the fantastic diversity and, of course, quality of work they are doing. Also very much explaining very clearly how really curiosity-driven or passion-driven, as Sir Peter told us we should speak about, is really very essential for the future developments. And really that very often, as we were explained, you come up with a solution as a researcher of a problem you never thought you would be tackling. So it is something which happens often. Of course, you need a very open mind. You need sometimes also to be pushed or to be confronted with people who just push you in a slightly different direction. But I think that's the whole spirit of ERC, and also the staff of the agency is also very good at accepting reorientation of projects when this is needed. And I think also, since these are very important, I'm speaking at the moment, a very important moment of conclusion for this discussion. You understand that all ERC grants could not exist without the strong support by the European Commission, in particular having an agency which is highly functional, and therefore thank you to everybody for the contributions of tonight, in particular to the people who were extremely busy, and on today being here was really a very great gift that we received from them. But at the same time to everybody who came here, so I hope you can really help us for the future. You know there is some more battles to fight, but I'm sure you are also in this fighting spirit we heard tonight. Thank you very much.